Okay, so we are back, and we have a good turnout despite the fact that it's a little rainy today. People are probably wondering how they're going to get back home, but it's okay. I mean, we've got Chaucer, right? So we can just go on and on and on. We could become like the Canterbury Pilgrims, and we could start a storytelling contest here. So, okay, at the end of last class, we were talking about some of the characters in the general prologue, some of Chaucer's fellow pilgrims, according to the fiction of the frame story. And we had already been looking at not only the frame story itself, but also we'd been looking at the descriptions of the knight and the squire in some detail, and also to a pretty fair degree the nun or prioress as well. And the point that I ended our last session with was that you'll notice at the end of her description how the pilgrim narrator Chaucer, the Chaucer figure in the work, responds to the loveliness of this woman. She's very, very attractive, and of course there's nothing wrong with her being very attractive. It's just that she obviously is putting on to a much greater degree than a nun was supposed to. And so again and again we have these gentle ironies. Chaucer is not terribly critical of her, but these gentle ironies directed toward her. And then we end with her having a pair of beads gauded all with graina, and thereon hang a brooch of gold full shena, on which there was first written a croned A, and after amor vincit omnia, or if you prefer, amor vincit omnia. Well, what is this? I mean, we're expecting prayer beads, aren't we? Well, then we see what she has on here is this jewelry which spells out amor vincit omnia. In other words, love conquers all. Well, okay, that's well and good for a kind of Christian sentiment in Augustinian fashion, except that the word amor was a term usually reserved for romantic or even sexual love, rather than for the love that God has towards his creatures and we are supposed to have towards our neighbors within the Christian tradition. The term that is usually used for that in Christian literature is the word caritas, which comes into the English language as charity. So there's once again a kind of ambiguity in the representation of the nun. She seems to be more worldly than perhaps she ought to be, given that she's a nun. Now, talk about worldliness. The next couple of people we have who are representatives of the official church, in the sense that they actually hold official positions in the church, are going to be the monk and the friar. Well, a monk was supposed to have been someone who withdrew from the world. That was the whole point of monasticism. Someone who withdrew from the world, who did not really participate in the activities of the world to any great degree, and who took very strict vows of poverty, of chastity, and of obedience to the rule of the monastery and of the monastic order. Well, what kind of a monk do we have here? We have a guy who's all dressed up in finery and who is dashing around the countryside with all of the upper class people, riding to hounds. He loved veneria, which is a kind of hunting, and so on and so on. I mean, what kind of a monk is this guy? Well, he's a very worldly monk. Now, it's true, he does have a job in the monastic community of being the business person, the one who would negotiate business of the monastery with the surrounding community or communities. But nevertheless, here is somebody who is far more worldly than a monk was supposed to be. And then when we get to the friar is a kind of con man. Friars were originally founded by St. Francis of Assisi and then his immediate followers to be people who would take part in the world. They did not withdraw from the world in the way monks did, but to take part in the world, but deliberately to live the lives of poor people. The whole point of Francis's life was that he was the son of a very, very wealthy banker. He was supposed to take over this wealthy banking business, and he refused to do so. Instead, he founded his order of friars. Friar is an English word which actually derives from the French word frère, which in turn derives from the Latin word frater, or brother. And so these brothers, and then eventually there was a parallel group of women who were the sisters, and what they were supposed to do was to live like poor people in the service of poor people, so that they were not supposed to receive any kind of property, and they were not supposed to have any kind of salary or direct income. They would go around literally begging for their food, clothing, take only what they needed for their own sustenance, and then give away the rest of it to the poor. So this was an organization which was founded in order to perform services to poor and needy people. Well, as it happened by Chaucer's time, in the later Middle Ages, the orders of friars had become very, very wealthy and very, very powerful, because lots of people would leave in their wills, would leave property, would leave money and so forth to the friars. We talked a little bit about that last time, some of the reasons for that. And so the orders of friars by Chaucer's time became very wealthy. And then there was a split, even among the Franciscan friars in the 14th century. Some of them wanted to continue being wealthy and powerful as they were. And then there was a whole other group that wanted to reform the order of friars so that they would go back to the kind of poverty to which they had been dedicated at the beginning, and therefore to serve needy and poor people and not accumulate goods for themselves. Well, look at our friar here. Our friar is exactly the opposite of that, isn't he? I mean, he's grabbing everything he can with both hands. He's even a kind of con man, where he will go to hear people's confessions and give them easy penances if they slip a little money in his direction. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the Catholic Church, there was the sacrament, which eventually developed at any rate, the sacrament, as it was called, of penance or of confession. And what that meant was that it eventually developed among the Irish monks, by the way, in the earlier Middle Ages, that instead of having a kind of public confession in which everybody would get up and proclaim in the early church that they were sinners and that they were sorry for their sins, the Irish monks in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries came up with the idea that if the priest was going to have some power on God's behalf, as God's agent on earth, to release people from the punishment due to their sins through the sacrament of confession or penance, then they had to know what these sins actually were, and they had to be able to make judgments about assessing the penances that people would have to perform for their sins. And in the Middle Ages, by the way, penances tended to be very severe, not little token, say a few prayers kinds of penances. And so as a consequence, people began to go individually to a priest to confess their sins, and then the priest would assess what kind of penances would be due. As a result, there were also penitential manuals that developed in the early and central Middle Ages that became more and more and more and more elaborate. And those are interesting in themselves, by the way. You know, what did this society consider to be sinful? What is more sinful than something else, or less sinful than something else? You can see it all laid out there in the penitential manuals. You can see that this sin, for example, would require a penance of 3 days fasting, and another sin might require a period of 30 days of fasting. Fasting doesn't mean going totally without food, but simply scaling back on the amount of food and the kind of food that one ate. Well, obviously, the sin that had the 30-day fast was considered to be far more serious than the one that had the 3-day fast, and so on. So it's an interesting insight into at least how the church viewed different kinds of sins and what was more serious, what was less serious, and so forth. So these penitential manuals, many, many, many of which have survived into our time, provide us with an interesting view into a corner of social history. Well, what happens in the case of our friar? Once again, you go to our friar here and you confess your sins, and if you make a little donation to the friar and to the order of the friar, then the friar lets you off as easy as can be in your penance. The implication, of course, is if you don't slip him a little money, you're going to get hit with a really tough penance. He even goes to poor widows, and he's able to extort the few pennies that a poor widow will have in her purse with all of his glib charm. He pays for the dowries of young girls, and the implication here is that these are girls with whom he has had sexual relations himself, possibly even gotten pregnant, but at least has had sexual relations with himself. So here is our friar being as unfriar-like as one can imagine, and as worldly as one can imagine. Now this leads to a very interesting point in Chaucer, and also into many people in the later Middle Ages. Chaucer and many of his contemporaries were scandalized by what they thought were abuses taking place in the church. Now that doesn't mean that everybody was involved in abuses, but some people were. And our friar is a good example of that. Later on we're going to see that the summoner and the pardoner, likewise, are participating into some very serious abuses of their positions in the church. And so Chaucer and others were calling already for reforms in the church. And there were others, some of whom were very powerful, who tried, at least on a local level, to carry out reforms. But of course, these were not by any means general or universal. And so eventually, about 230 years or so after, about 130 years or so after the death of Chaucer, we have the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. And of course, from that point on, everything's going to change, not only with the development of the Protestant churches, but also with the Catholic Reformation cleaning up these abuses within the Catholic Church itself. So, it's interesting to find Chaucer engaging in this kind of criticism. And that opens up a very important point, that we have obviously a lot of secular characters here, don't we? You know, we've got the miller and the reeve, and we've got the sergeant of the law who's an attorney. We've got the physician. We've got the merchant. We've got a franklin who's a country squire. We have the guildsman. You know, we have the knight, obviously, and the squire and the yeoman. We've got quite a number of people who are in secular life, that is to say, who are not in religious life as such. Now, what do I mean by religious life as such? Within this church community, there were not only priests and nuns, but there were also lots of ancillary people who held official positions in the church. The summoner and the pardoner being examples of that. So you will notice then, if we can go now to the board, please. I'm going to put down some of these. We have the parson. And we're going to see in just a moment here. Let's see. Can we go? Thank you. We have the parson. Is that large enough to read off the screen? Okay. We have the parson, who's essentially a very good person. Very honest, very honorable. He doesn't try to accumulate a lot of money, and what he does have, he gives away to the poor. And so he's basically a good guy. Also, his brother, the plowman, doesn't take advantage of people as he might have, but is basically a good Christian man, just like the parson is. So we have the parson, who's basically a good person. The clerk could go in here because the clerk is studying to be a clergyman. The word clerk, by the way, in the Middle Ages didn't mean what we mean by clerk as such. It's a word that derives from the Latin word clericus, which is also the word that comes into our language as cleric or as clergy. So the clerk is somebody who is studying to become a clergyman. You know, the first universities were basically set up in order to train people who were going to be in the clergy. And they gradually expanded to include schools of medicine and of law, but the primary mission of the universities was in the training of clergy. And our clerk has advanced pretty far along with his undergraduate education. He's now up to logic, which was the highest undergraduate portion of the curriculum, or a portion of the undergraduate curriculum. Whether or not he will actually become a clergyman is not clear, because not everybody did. You know, you could go through this kind of education and then decide, well, maybe you didn't want to enter into the clergy. And so you could become, for example, the secretary to a member of the nobility. Also, it happened in the Middle Ages, especially the later Middle Ages, that there were a lot of people who had university-level education or something very close to it, and who couldn't get employment because in those kinds of jobs, because there were only so many of those kinds of jobs to go around, and the universities were producing a surplus of educated people. And so many of these became the wandering scholars, as they were called, who went around Europe, and they lived a very kind of bohemian life, which is very interesting. They formed almost a kind of counterculture. Well, I shouldn't even say almost a counterculture. It was a counterculture, which often was very critical of the establishment, especially the church. So we have the parson and the clerk, who are basically good people. And then if we can go back to the tablet, please. And then we have somebody like the nun or prioress. Whoops, what am I doing here? Who's basically a good person. Remember, we talked about this at the end of our last segment, that she's not everything that a nun was supposed to be, but she's still a decent person. And then we have somebody like the monk, who's not really corrupt. He's just too worldly for what a monk was supposed to be. And then we have the friar. Notice that I'm going from high to low morally or ethically in Chaucer's scheme of things here in the general prologue. The friar who is actually abusing his position, but he's not seriously corrupt yet in the way some other figures are going to be. And we also have the summoner, who was an official, a minor official, in the ecclesiastical courts. And what that meant was, in the ecclesiastical court system, which was run by the church, there were certain kinds of offenses that you could get called before the courts for, which were not necessarily the same, though sometimes there was an unfortunate overlapping, as what you would find in the secular courts or civil courts. So that there were all kinds of offenses for which you could be hauled in front of a judge in the civil courts, just as today. But then, on the other hand, there were the church courts. And the church courts, generally speaking, would hear issues that would have to do with the clergy or other religious who might have gotten out of line, and so they could be tried before these courts. Questions of annulments of marriages would be heard by the church courts. And by the way, that was actually a pretty common procedure, the annulments of marriages. But you had to have enough money to pursue the case through the courts. And there were also other kinds of offenses, moral offenses, that could be brought before the ecclesiastical courts, though they very, very seldom were. But what the summoner does, we find out, is he has a bunch of, in effect, blank summonses, which is an official document that once you're handed this, you have to appear in court. We find out not only here in the general prologue some hints of this, but also later on when he and the friar get into tales told against one another, that one of the corrupt practices of summoners like this guy was that they would sneak around, they would find somebody who was doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing. You know, here is so-and-so who's having an affair with somebody else to whom the person is not married, and would then serve the person a summons to appear in court unless you bought the summoner off. And then the summoner would withdraw it. Well, of course, who would want the public scandal, to say nothing of the embarrassment, of being hauled into court for an offense like this? So, naturally enough, people, if they could afford to do so, would buy off the summoner. Does that mean that all summoners were corrupt? No, not necessarily, but some apparently were. And certainly our summoner appears to be. And then finally we get to the pardoner. This is among the church people. And so we have a scale here, with the pardoner being the most corrupt, and the parson up at the top of my list being the one who most nearly attains to the ideal of what an official of the church was supposed to be. And then notice how you can work your way either down or up that scale. So, what about this pardoner? Well, let's flip over to look at the description of the pardoner. The pardoner is in, the description of him begins in line 677. This pardoner had hair as yellow as wax, but smooth it hung, as doth a streak of flax. Be ounces hang his lockes that he hadde, and therewith hae his shoulders overspreadde. So he's got his long blonde hair spread out over his shoulders, but thin it lay by strands, be colpons, and on be on, but hod for jollity where'd he none, for it was trussed up in his wallet. Him thought he rode all the newer jet. This is a guy who's dressed up in all kinds of fancy, fashionable clothes, fashionable for the day. And this Chevrolet sav his cop he rode all bara, switch glorying Ian had a he as an hara. Not a very nice way to look or be described. A vernicle had he sewed upon his cop. This is a symbol that one was on a religious pilgrimage. His wallet before him in his lappa, breadful of pardon, come from Rome all hot. Well, what are we talking about here? What are pardons? I mentioned this a couple of classes ago. Gradually, and certainly by the Central Middle Ages, the church had begun to define the concept of purgatory, remember? So that the idea developed that there would be people, probably most of us, who were at their deaths not quite good enough in their lives to go straight on to heaven, but also not really bad enough to go to hell. And so they would go to a temporary place of purgation of their sins, which was called purgatory. And you would be judged at the time of your death to have to serve a certain amount of time in purgatory before your sins would be purged away and you could proceed on to heaven. Well, you could shorten the time of being in purgatory by doing good deeds. So if you did charitable work, that would count against whatever sins you might have committed, and it would shorten your time in purgatory. Or, well, what if you don't have the time to do charitable work, like working in a hospital as a volunteer? And what if instead you give money to the hospital? Well, yeah, that's a good deed, and so that would count against your time in purgatory too. Well, what if you simply give money to the representative of a hospital without ever going near the hospital? Well, yes, that's a good deed, and that would count against your time in purgatory. And you can see the direction in which this was going. So that, certainly not for everybody, but for people like our pardoner, what this came down to was the selling of indulgences or pardons. And what an indulgence or pardon was the release of a certain amount of time from purgatory. Okay? So, here he has pardons come from Rome all hot. Well, of course, this guy's a con man. He's making all this stuff up. A voice he had as small as hath a goat, no beard had a hay, nor never a shoulder have. As smooth it was as it were lot e shava. E tro he were a gelding or a mara. I think he was, or I'm not quite sure which he was, a gelding or a mare. Well, a gelding is a castrated horse, and of course a mare is a female horse, and to use either one of those to describe this guy is not very favorable towards him, right? I mean, this is where Chaucer gives up the gentle kind of satire that he had used earlier on some of the other pilgrims, and he's really going after this guy. So, but of his croft for Berwick unto Warra, no was there switch another pardonaire. He's very, very good at what he does. For in his mouth he had a pilwa bear, a pillowcase, which that he said was Ur Ladi veil. This is the veil of the Blessed Virgin Mary herself, which I have. You can step forward and pay me whatever it is that I'm going to charge you for it, or nowadays I suppose put it on eBay. And this is the authentic, and I will give you a letter to demonstrate that this is an authentic veil of the Blessed Virgin Mary herself. He said he had a gobbet of the sail, a piece of the sail, that Saint Peter had a one he went upon the say, till Jesu Christ him henta. Remember the stories of, well, Peter was a fisherman, right, along with a bunch of the other guys of Jesus' early followers. And here's a piece of the sail of their boat, of Peter's boat. I have it right here. He had a cross of laton, full of stones, and in a glass he had a pig's bones. But with these relics, one that he found a poor person dwelling him upon the land upon a day, he got him more money than that the person got in months tway. Well, relics. Relics. The function of relics began with the veneration of saints, particularly the martyrs in the early church. And remember what I said about saints in our last segment. The function of a saint in the early Christian church was that the saint was an exemplary person who had lived a very specially virtuous kind of Christian life, even to the point, in some cases, of becoming a martyr for one's faith. And so the saint was somebody whom you could pray to and get to God through a powerful intermediary. You know, that maybe you didn't want to pray directly to God himself, but what you could do is you could pray to one of his saints and ask the saint to intercede with God on your behalf. And the veneration of the saints gradually gave way to the veneration of the relics of the saints. Well, what are relics? Relics are remains. And the first class relics were literal remains of the saint, that is to say, the bones of the saint. Secondly, there would be things that were physically associated with the saint, such as articles of the saint's clothing. And then thirdly, there could be a kind of relic which came in contact with one of the first two, and that was called a third-class relic. And having such relics and venerating such relics was also thought to get one pardons or indulgences from one's time in purgatory after one's death. Okay? Now, whatever you may think of the practice of the collecting and the veneration of relics, it was a widespread practice in the later Middle Ages particularly. And here, this guy doesn't even have authentic relics. He's got a jar full of pig's bones, that he's trying to pass off as relics of saints. Well, you know, what kind of a guy are we dealing with? He's obviously a religious con man of the lowest order. reminds me, some years ago, I was listening to a radio program and then actually called up and got in the mail an advertisement that for, at that time, I believe it was $3, I could get an autographed picture of Jesus Christ. And unfortunately, I didn't send off for it. I mean, can you imagine, for $3? I would have that right now, and I could bring it in, and I could show it to you. Well, that's the sort of thing that the partner is doing. You see, he's conning people. He's conning gullible people in order to squeeze a little bit of money out of them. And that's all he cares about. And despite the fact that, as the description goes on, he's a noble ecclesiasta, that is to say, he's very good at what he does in church. He's a brilliant preacher. He's a brilliant preacher. But what does he preach for? He preaches only to win silver. And so that's his whole game. Okay. Well, we go on, and in The Pardoner's Tale, well, especially the prologue to The Pardoner's Tale, a little bit later on in the Canterbury Tales. And we're not reading that here, so don't get alarmed. That's not something that I'm sneaking in, even though it wasn't on the syllabus. But in The Pardoner's Tale and the prologue to his tale, the pardoner tells us straight out that he is a con man, but that he's very, very good at it. He always preaches sermons on how the love of money and the acquisition of money is the root of all evil. Radix malorum est cupiditas. The root of all evils is cupidity, or the excessive love of money and of physical things. And he says, but that was only to gull the people. That was only to get as much out of them as I possibly could. And then he goes on and tells a story, the moral of which is basically that. Well, so much for our partner. And so you can see then why I have put him at the bottom of our moral scale among those Canterbury pilgrims who are official members of the church. Not just regular Christians, but people who hold some kind of office in the church. Because the partner works for a hospital. And in the Middle Ages, they didn't have hospitals like ours. Hospitals were places that you would take people who were very seriously injured or sick or people who were dying, and they would be taken care of by volunteers of one kind or another, and people who were nurses and so forth. If they were lucky, maybe a physician would look in on them from time to time. And the hospitals didn't charge fees in our sense of charging fees. And so they were supported largely by charity. And that's what our partner does. He's a fundraiser for a hospital. But notice that he keeps a lot for himself along the way. Well, we have a number of these marvelous, marvelous descriptions of people. And so I'm going to take you now to another one, which is the, let's look at the clerk. The clerk is in 287 and following. A clerk there was of Oxenford also, that unto logic had long ago, and I believe we have a footnote here. Logic was the principal study of an undergraduate in the curriculum. You would proceed through 4 basic subjects, and you would get to 3 advanced subjects, and the 3 advanced subjects were grammar, which doesn't mean what we mean by grammar. It wasn't the study of things like subjects and verbs and punctuation and so forth, but it was actually the study of literary and other kinds of texts. And then rhetoric, which was not only the analysis of various kinds of texts, but also how to compose them. And then finally you would proceed to logic, which was at the top of the undergraduate curriculum, because it was thought that once you had mastered logic, you could really function with anything else, any of the other learned disciplines, because the function of logic was to teach you to think critically and logically. So that's where he is in the curriculum. As lame was his horse as is a raka. You see, his horse is not only lean, but lean as a rake, which means that like a rake, you see, it has all of its bones showing. And hij was nooit recht fat I undertaka, but looked hawa anderto soberly, full threadbara was his overest kurtape. For hij had gotten him yet no benefice. That is to say, he hadn't yet gotten some sort of a position in a church which would help to support him. Now was so worldly for to have office. For him was lever have at his bed his head 20 books clad in black or red of Aristotle and his philosophy. 20 books clad in black and red of Aristotle and Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle had been rediscovered in the Central Middle Ages by the West. It's an interesting story. You know, you wonder what happened to a lot of ancient classical culture after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Well, much of it survived. But you know where it survived? It survived in places that were relatively untouched. Ireland was one in the West, but also among the Arabic scholars of North Africa. There was a tremendous cultural upsurgence among the Arabic scholars and poets and musicians and mathematicians and architects and artists during what in the West was known as the Middle Ages, so that in our Western Middle Ages, Arabic civilization, at least before the time of the Crusades, was actually at a much higher level of culture than it was throughout Western Europe, which is very interesting. And the kind of learning that was taking place among the Arabic scholars was very far advanced beyond what was taking place in Western Europe generally. Spain being an interesting exception, because remember that Spain had also been taken over by the people who in Europe called the Moors, who were of course Arabs, and of course they were Muslims, who lived in Spain side by side with Christians and Jews in a very easygoing and tolerant kind of society. So that Spain in Western Europe actually achieved the highest level of culture in the early to central Middle Ages. Now, around the 12th century, Westerners began to discover from the Arabic scholars the works of Aristotle and other ancient classical philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, and so forth. And the works which had been translated from Greek into Arabic were now translated into Latin to make them available to the learned people of Western Europe. And so there was a whole revolution, what sometimes is called the 12th century Renaissance. There was a whole revolution in Western culture as a result. as a result of all of this seemingly new learning, which was actually very old learning, flowing into Western Europe. And it wasn't simply the work of Aristotle and Galen and Greek mathematicians and so on, but now this had also been improved on by the Arabic scholars and mathematicians and scientists as well. So Western culture was profoundly affected by the Arabic culture of the Middle Ages. In fact, the advances that took place in the West could not have taken place had it not been for these materials flowing from what Westerners called the Middle East, which is a very interesting chapter in our cultural history. But in any event, Aristotle became what Dante called the master of those who know. He became, the premier philosopher in the West. So that's why our clerk would rather have his books of Aristotle's philosophy than fine clothes. And so when we get to the end of his description, this is in 309 and 310, "Soning in moral virtue was his speech," and then a very, very famous line, "Ungladly wold he learn, ungladly teach." The ideal of the scholar. Gladly would he learn and gladly teach. Well, okay, so we go on and we see some very interesting other descriptions here. Look at the good wife of Bath. This is in 447 and following. "A good wife was there of beside Bath, but she was somedel deaf, and that was scathe." We find out later on how she got to be deaf when we read her prologue. "Of cloth making she had switch and haunt, she passed him of Ypres and of Gaunt." She's very, very, very good at this trade. And we find out how and why in her prologue. She inherited all these businesses from her husbands when they died. "In all the parish weef there was there none that to the offering before her shoulder gone, and if there did, certain so wroth was she, that she was out of all charité." What people used to do in the Middle Ages at the beginning or toward the beginning of the religious service was there was a time that was called the offering or the offertory, and everybody would go in procession up to the front of the church, and they would leave before the altar whatever they had to offer. And in some cases this could be money or something like that, but it could be goods. Like farmers could bring some of their vegetables for the local priest or something like that. And she would be out of all charity if anybody got in front of her. She was always elbowing her way to the front. "Her coverchiefs were full fiendware of grund. He durst swear they weighed in 10 pound. These are the coverchiefs around her face and head. "That on a Sunday wearing upon her head, her hosen wearing a fiend scarlet red." This is not some shy, retiring woman. She's wearing bright scarlet hose. "Full straight he tied and shows full moist and newe. Bold was her face, and fair and red of hue. She was a worthy woman all her live, whose bundes at church adore she had a fever." 5 husbands she had at the church door. Without counting other people she kept company with in her youth, which of course is a sly little reference to lovers earlier on. But thereof needeth not to speak as nuth. You know, I'm much too gentlemanly to go into that. On 3 years had she been at Jerusalem. She had a passed many a stranger stream. At Rome she had a been, and at Bologna, etc., etc. In other words, she had been to all of the pilgrimage sites. Why is she going? Well, it's not so much for religious piety as it is that she's out to have a good time. And one of the reasons why she's on this pilgrimage is she's looking for husband number 6. Got-toothed was she. Gap-toothed? What that is if it's a genetic thing, a hereditary thing, that some people don't have lateral incisors for whatever reason, and so there will be a space then between their 2 front teeth. So that was called gap-toothed at an earlier time. And this was supposed to be an invariable sign of a lustful personality. So that's why it's attributed here to her. Upon an ambler easily she sat, y wimpled well, and on her head a hat as broad as is a buckler or a targe. A buckler, it's great big hat, you know, like a shield or a target. A footmantel about her hippes large, and on her fate a pair of spurs sharpa. In fellowship she well could she loch and carpa, of remedies of love she canoe perchance, for she could of that art the old dance. Well. Okay, so she knew the remedies of love. Well, according to the Roman poet Ovid, in his famous poetic work on the art of love, the last part of it, in the earlier parts, it's, you know, you're falling in love or you're trying to get somebody to fall in love with you and then carrying on the love affair. And then the last part of it is the remedies of love. Well, the remedies of love consist of the ways of getting out of a love affair, according to Ovid. Well, apparently that's the sort of thing that we have here. But also, notice, she well knew the art of the old dance. Well, now, you know, I don't know why, but in our footnote here, we have, she knew all the tricks of the trade. Well, the old dance is simply a euphemism for sexual intercourse. And so, see, she's an expert. She's an expert on all of these things, as we will find out more when we get to her prologue and tale. So, what we're getting then in the general prologue is this very lively depiction of all of these different people who have come together, unlikely as it may seem, because most of them really don't have any reason to be together, except that they're all going on the same pilgrimage at the same time to Canterbury. But that provides Chaucer with this wonderful opportunity to have this social mixing of different peoples, which was like unto what was beginning to happen in English or late medieval society in general at this time. So we'll go on with this anon.